talking about the different types of land plants and how they evolved over time. All right, so land plants originally evolved from algae that lived in the water, specifically green algae, because there are different lineages of algae. There's brown algae and red algae and green algae. Land plants only came from green algae. So they evolved from these aquatic organisms and they evolved to live on land, which means they had very specific adaptations to live on land because their environments drastically changed. Now, this change happened around, I believe, 850 million years ago is when plants began to colonize dry land, which is a really long time ago, and they came from these freshwater green algae. And they're going to have very specific adaptations because, as you can imagine, moving from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment has its issues. And some of the adaptations, which you will all learn more about in later lessons, are going to be things like the cuticle, which is a waxy covering of the plants, which helps them retain water because they're no longer living in the water, they're now living in the air. They have the possibility of drying out. They also have things like seeds, vascular tissue. Some of them even have pollen, which allows them to reproduce without water, which is very interesting. So there are many adaptations, which we will learn more about in later lessons. But right now, let's talk about the lineage and the evolution of these land plants. So land plants, as we normally call them, is a very informal name. It's just talking about all of the plants on land. But this is a very informal name, and it's actually very interesting. Land plants also encompasses some plants that went back to an aquatic ecosystem that are now aquatic again. They went from aquatic to terrestrial to aquatic through their evolutionary processes. So land plants, if you want to be more specific, you're going to call them embryophytes. Embryophytes are a specific type of organism that holds the embryo or the developing offspring inside of the tissues of the parent. Don't worry, you will learn more about that specific quality in later lessons when we talk about plant reproduction. I was just telling you why they have this particular name. Now, there are three types of land plants: non-vascular, seedless vascular, and seed plants. And they did evolve in that particular order. Non-vascular plants came first, then seedless vascular, and then seed plants. The majority of the plants that you think of are going to be seed plants, and they're going to be the youngest and generally the most specialized plants that live on dry land. But first, let's talk about non-vascular plants. These are going to be the first plants that actually colonize land, and they're going to be very similar to the green freshwater algae that they evolved from. So these were the first land plants, and they lacked these particular structures called tracheids. Now, tracheids are going to be a type of plant cell. And tracheids are cells with very thick walls made of lignin. Lignin is like cellulose. It is a very important structural component of most plants, except for non-vascular plants. You'll find that seedless vascular and seed plants have this lignin cell wall component to their anatomy, and this is going to be very important for structure. This is going to give them the ability to grow taller and larger. But non-vascular plants, the first land plants, didn't have tracheids, they didn't have lignin, so they were not able to grow to great size. So they could not support large vertical growth. They couldn't grow really tall. Now, you would be knowing this now, you're probably not surprised to hear that non-vascular plants are going to be things like moss and liverworts, which sound awful, but they're actually not as awful as they sound. So moss, liverworts, I also believe hornworts are non-vascular plants, and these are going to be plants that are also called bryophytes, which we'll learn more about in their own lesson. There's a whole lesson on bryophytes. But these are very short plants, very small plants. Moss is kind of like little little tufts of hair or grass on the ground. They don't get very tall. And the reason is because they did not evolve tracheids. They're the first land plants. They didn't have this adaptation as of yet. Now, these plants are a gametophyte dominant life cycle. You will find that the other two types of plants, seedless vascular and seeded plants, are not gametophyte dominant life cycle. They're sporophyte dominant life cycle. And this means, because they're gametophyte dominant life cycle, that they are haploid most of their life. They only have one set of chromosomes the majority of their life, their dominant part of their life. Now, they do have some sort of internal water conducting tissue, but they don't have vascular tissue that the larger plants of land today actively have. So they don't have as specialized water and nutrient conducting tissue. So that's also why they're very small. Now, let's go on to the next type of plants. We have the seedless vascular plants. These are going to be the ones that evolved next. Seedless vascular plants are a paraphyletic group, which I'll explain more when we look at the phylogeny down here in just a second. Basically, what that means is seedless vascular plants, that term, that group name, encompasses the ancestor of vascular plants, but it doesn't encompass all of the descendants of that ancestor, because the other descendants of that ancestor are going to be seeded plants, and obviously they're not seedless vascular plants, they're seeded vascular plants. So, but don't get too much into the specifics. I'll show you guys the phylogeny in just a second. Okay, so what's new about these plants is that they have vascular tissue. That means that they have specialized water conducting and nutrient conducting tissue that acts a lot like our blood vessel system does. It is able to transport water and nutrients to the extremities of the plant. This allows the plants to get a lot bigger because they are able to move water and nutrients farther. So these are also going to be plants that have a sporophyte dominant life cycle. Remember that non-vascular are gametophyte dominant life cycle. Seedless vascular plants are sporophyte dominant life cycle, meaning that most of their life they are going to be diploid and they're going to have two sets of chromosomes in their cells. Also, they evolved lignin, like we talked about earlier, and this allows them to have strong vascular networks, and it allows them to support more vertical growth. So these are going to be larger plants. These are going to be things like ferns, and horsetails are also seedless vascular plants. So they have vascular conducting tissue. They are able to grow taller because of their lignin, but they don't have seeds as of yet. So now let's move on to the seeded vascular plants. So we just call these seed plants, but these are most of the plants that you think of today whenever you think of a plant. And this is going to encompass the gymnosperms and the angiosperms, two different types of seeded plants. Gymnosperms have naked seeds. These are going to be things like conifers. Basically what this means is they don't have an active protection around their seeds and they don't have any parental part around their seeds. So the opposite of that is going to be angiosperms. Angiosperms are enclosed seeds. So you'll find that angiosperms will commonly hold their seeds inside, oh, I'm sorry, I'm in the way, guys. They'll commonly hold their seeds inside of a nut or inside of a fruit. So their seed is enclosed, while gymnosperms have naked seeds. It's not enclosed. So angiosperms are going to be all types of flowering plants. That is what makes angiosperms so unique. They are flowering plants and they have pollen. So all seeded plants are going to have pollen as well. These gymnosperms have pollen and so do these angiosperms. So they have vascular tissue, they have lignin, they have tracheids, they have seeds. Seeds is a very important adaptation because seeds protect the developing embryo and they allow that embryo to have a better chance of survival. All right, so just so you guys know, remember that gymnosperms are generally conifers, so things like pine trees. All right, so now let's go down and let's have a look at this phylogeny that we have here. So this is a pretty big phylogeny. And let me scroll down so you guys can see the bottom. So at the bottom here, you all can see that we have these green algae species. And these green algae species are going to be the ancestors to land plants. Now, land plants are going to be from here and above. So those are going to be our land plants, which you guys can see, it says embryophyta. So these are the embryophytes or the land plants. And the first particular types of land plants to evolve are going to be those bryophytes. Those are the non-vascular plants. So non-vascular plants are the bryophytes. And these are going to contain the hornworts, the mosses, and the liverworts. Very low profile, very small plants. Now, as we go up in the phylogenetic tree, we're going to move on to things like ferns and horsetails. So these are going to be our seedless vascular plants that evolved from our non-vascular seedless plants. And these are going to be things like the ferns and the horsetails that we talked about. Remember, they're now able to grow taller, they have lignin, and they have vascular tissue. They are able to transport water and nutrients around their bodies, so they're able to get larger. And this includes all of the vascular plants here, which is the vascular seedless plants and the vascular seeded plants. And as we move farther up the phylogeny, we can move on to the seeded plants, which are going to be things like gymnosperms and angiosperms. So these are our flowering plants, our conifers, our cycads, our ginkgos, and those are going to be, ginkgos and cycads are not as common as conifers and flowering plants, so you might not know exactly what they look like. I would definitely recommend looking them up if you would like to know. But these are going to be more specialized plants, more specialized to living on land, because they're going to have things like pollen. They're going to have things like seeds and flowers that are specifically adapted to live and reproduce on land. And remember, guys, they also have this vascular tissue and this lignin. So angiosperms and gymnosperms are generally the largest plants on our planet because of their structural abilities, and angiosperms are going to be the most successful, I guess you could say, or the most prominent types of plants on our planet, because flowering plants have done so incredibly well because they interact with the environment greatly and they interact with animal and insect pollinators very well as well. Okay, everyone, now let's go on and learn more about specific types of plants and the specific adaptations that land plants acquired.